Imagine standing on a cold shoreline in the year 900. The sea is iron gray. A narrow ship slices through the mist. 50 men row in perfect rhythm, guided not by a compass, but by memory, the sun, the stars, and instinct. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were specialists of navigation and sailing. They were also exceptional in several other areas. And in those specific disciplines, they were simply better than anyone else on Earth at the time. This episode is something a little different. From time to time, here on Viking Legacy and Lore, we're going to step back from the saga, the battlefields, and we're going to look at the world from a different angle. We're launching a new style of episode called Viking Age Top 10. In this episode, we'll explore lists that highlight the most fascinating, surprising, and sometimes misunderstood parts of the Viking world. Today's list, the top 10 things that Vikings did better than anyone else. Now, that might sound like a bold statement, but when you look closely at their ships, their exploration, trade networks, and their courage to sail into waters no one had ever mapped, you start to realize something. The Viking Age was more than just simple farmers turned raiders. There was technological advancement that exceeded other civilizations at the time. If you enjoy this style of episode, I'd love to hear from you. Send your thoughts, your ideas for future top 10s, and other episodes, other topics that you'd like to hear covered. So send a quick email to vikinglegacyandlore@gmail.com, because some of the best episode ideas on this podcast come directly from listeners like you. Now, let's step back into the Viking Age and look at the top 10 things Vikings did better than anyone. Starting off with number 10, storytelling and oral history. The Vikings produced some of the richest storytelling traditions in Europe, in a world where most people could not read, and writing materials were very precious and rare. History survived through the power of human voice. Stories were told beside winter fires, in crowded halls during long feasts, and on ships rocking against the cold northern waves. Memory was the library of the Viking world, and storytellers were the librarians. Their sagas preserved an astonishing amount of detail about their lives and their world. These stories recorded genealogies, tracing the lineage of families and kings across generations. They told of battles fought for honor, land, and reputation. They described long voyages across unknown seas, journeys that stretched from Scandinavia to the edge of North America and deep into the rivers of Eastern Europe. And woven through these narratives were moral lessons about courage, loyalty, pride, and revenge. Without these stories, we wouldn't know the Viking Age the way we do. The sagas remember the voyage of Leif Erikson, who sailed west and reached the shores of North America centuries before Columbus. They recount the dramatic founding of Iceland, where settlers fled from the political turmoil in Norway and built a new society on a volcanic island in the North Atlantic. They preserve legendary deeds of kings, warriors, explorers, and ordinary people whose lives shaped the Viking world. All of this survived long before the printing press existed. Stories were memorized, repeated, and refined across generations. Skilled storytellers could recount complex events, family histories, and historic sagas that lasted for hours. When these stories were finally written down in medieval Iceland, they captured a living memory that had already traveled through centuries of spoken tradition. The sagas were not merely entertainment, they were a way to establish identity. They were a cultural memory bank. They were the Vikings' way of remembering who they were and the legacy they came from. And because those stories survived, the Viking Age still speaks to us today. Now, while storytelling helped preserve the memory of the Viking world, something else helped hold Viking society together. That brings us to number 9. Law and democracy. The Viking world was not nearly as chaotic as people imagine. Popular culture often paints Vikings as nothing more than raiders and warriors, living by the sword and settling disputes with violence alone. But that picture misses an important part of their society. Across Scandinavia, free men gathered in assemblies called things. These meetings, they were not small or informal. They were central institutions of Viking life. They were communities come together to govern themselves. At these assemblies, people met to vote, settle disputes, pass laws. You had farmers, chieftains, merchants, travelers, and they would all gather, sometimes in open fields, sometimes in sacred sites, to hear cases, to negotiate settlements, and to debate decisions that affected the entire community. Law speakers were individuals who memorized the legal tradition. They would recite the laws aloud so that everyone present could hear and understand them. One of the most famous of these assemblies is Iceland's national parliament, the Althing. Founded in 930, the Althing became the central gathering place for Iceland settlers. Each summer, leaders, farmers from across the island, they would travel to where the nation's law was spoken. They would settle disputes and they would form alliances. And remarkably, the Althing is considered one of the oldest parliament institutions in the world, and it still exists today in modern Iceland. In a time when many kingdoms ruled through absolute authority and brutal military force, Viking society built systems that relied on debate, reputation, and community judgment. Was it perfect? No, not at all. Powerful men still held influence, and justice could sometimes depend on your alliance and honor. But the system worked well enough to maintain order across vast and scattered communities. It was justice. It was rough justice, but it was justice. And of course, laws and assemblies helped organize Viking communities at home. But when Vikings traveled beyond Scandinavia, something even more remarkable happened. And that's number 8. They adapted to new cultures better than anyone. The Vikings had an unusual ability that few expanding societies ever mastered. They didn't just conquer lands, they became part of them. When Viking settlers arrived in new regions, they often adapted quickly to the cultures around them. Instead of remaining outsiders for generations, they blended with local populations, adopted new languages, new customs, and new political systems. Within a surprisingly short amount of time, Viking communities could transform themselves into something new entirely. Within a generation or two, Viking settlers could take on completely different identities. One of the most famous is found in France, where Viking raiders were granted land along the Seine River in the early 900s. Over time, the Norse settlers adopted the French language, converted to Christianity, and became known as the Normans, meaning the Northmen. Another example appears in Eastern Europe, where Scandinavian traders and warriors, they helped establish what became known as the Rus. The Norse leaders ruled over the Slavic populations, eventually forming powerful states centered around cities like Kiev. Over time, the Norse identity blended with Slavic culture, leaving behind the foundations of future Russian and Ukrainian history. And far to the south, Viking warriors, they served as the elite Varangian Guard, personal bodyguards to the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. These men traveled thousands of miles from Scandinavia to serve one of the most powerful rulers in the world. A Viking warrior could become many things in his lifetime: a knight, a king, an imperial bodyguard. Few cultures in history adapted so quickly or so effectively when encountering new societies. The Vikings were not just conquerors, they were cultural chameleons, capable of reshaping themselves wherever they went. The Vikings could adapt to new cultures and societies, but their resilience went far beyond political identity. Some of their most impressive achievements came in places where survival itself seemed almost impossible. And so for number 7, they did frontier survival better than anyone. The Vikings, they were extraordinary frontier settlers. They pushed beyond the comfortable edges of the known world and established communities in places that many people would have considered completely unlivable. These were not gentle landscapes or fertile river valleys waiting to be farmed. These were harsh, unpredictable environments at the far north edge of the medieval world. And yet the Vikings, they went there anyway. They settled Iceland, a rugged volcanic island filled with lava fields, glaciers, and limited farmland. When Norwegian settlers began to arrive in the 9th century, they found a land beautiful but unforgiving. Forests were scarce, the growing seasons were short, the weather could change suddenly. Still, they built farms, raised families, and established a thriving society that would produce some of the greatest literature of the Middle Ages. They pushed even further west to Greenland, Settling along frozen edges of the Arctic, life there was even more difficult. Winters were long and brutal, the soil was thin, and supplies from Europe, they were rare. Yet Viking settlers managed to build farms, raise livestock, and maintain communities for centuries. Across the North Atlantic islands, from the Faroe Islands to remote coastal settlements, Viking communities learned how to survive in environments defined by wind, cold, and isolation. They did this through careful preparation and innovation. Viking farmers adapted their methods to short growing seasons. They managed livestock carefully, protecting sheep and cattle through harsh winters. Food had to be preserved, stored, and rationed months in advance. These communities endured brutal winters, isolation, and unpredictable conditions that could destroy any unprepared settlement. The Vikings were not just sailors or warriors. They were frontier specialists, capable of building life on the very edge of the inhabitable, and sometimes uninhabitable world. The Vikings could survive brutal frontiers, but survival alone didn't make them feared across Europe. What was truly terrifying to their enemies was how they fought. Number 6, amphibious warfare. Viking warfare was fast, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling to the people who faced it. Unlike any medieval army, Viking raiders didn't march slowly across land or wait for formal battles to begin. They moved with speed and flexibility that most kingdoms simply couldn't match. In many ways, they perfected what modern militaries call amphibious assault. A fleet of long ships would appear on the horizon, slip quietly into the mouth of the river. Ships would move swiftly inland, carried by the wind, the current, and the strength of the rowers. Before local defenses could organize, the raiders would land suddenly. Their pattern, it was brutally efficient. Sail up the river, along the coast, land suddenly, quietly, strike quickly, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. This mobility allowed Viking raiders to strike cities and monasteries far from their homeland and further inland than anyone imagined was possible. Places that believed themselves safe suddenly found war at their doorstep. Paris itself was attacked this way. London felt the pressure of the Viking fleets moving up the Thames. Even the distant city of Seville in Spain was raided because Vikings sailed upriver more than 60 miles. For their enemies, the fear was constant. The attack might come tomorrow, or next year, or from where you least expect it. The picture we painted so far is pointing us to the number one thing the Vikings did better than anyone in the world. But before we get there, before we get to number one, there are a few more impressive things that Scandinavians did better than anyone. And sailing upriver, that's one thing. Settling on a coast where your ship runs aground is another. But how did they end up at the mouth of these rivers? How did they end up on shores worlds apart? Well, number 5, navigation. Navigation without instruments. The Vikings sailed enormous distances across open ocean, often far beyond the sight of land. Their journeys carried them across the cold, unpredictable waters of the North Atlantic, deep into unfamiliar seas. What makes it even more remarkable is that they did it without a compass, without charts, without modern navigation tools. Instead, Viking sailors relied on a deep knowledge of the natural world. They learned to navigate using the position of the sun, the movement of the stars, bird migration patterns, the rhythm of the ocean swells, and possibly special crystals known as Icelandic sunstones. During the day, the sun gave direction across the sky. Even on cloudy days, experienced sailors could estimate its location through subtle changes in light and shadow. Some historians believe that the Vikings used crystals like the Icelandic spar. They used it to detect polarized light, allowing them to locate the hidden position of the sun, even when it occurred during clouds or fog. At night, the stars became their compass. Familiar constellations helped sailors maintain direction as their ship moved across vast dark waters. Birds also offered clues. If certain seabirds appeared, it often meant land was nearby. Viking sailors knew the habits of these birds and used them as natural guides. But even the movement of the sea itself produced information. Long ocean swells often traveled in a constant direction across great distances. Skilled sailors could feel these patterns through the hull of the ship and use them to stay on course. Using this blend of observation, experience, and intuition, Viking crews crossed the North Atlantic again and again. They sailed between Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. These were some of the most dangerous waters in the world, filled with storms, fog, and freezing temperatures. Even modern sailors with advanced instruments and satellite navigation treat these waters with respect. The Vikings, however, mastered them, and their ability to find a way across vast oceans opened the door to something even greater. Because once you can navigate the seas, you can begin to connect the world. And that opened the door to number 4, trade networks. Viking traders built one of the largest and most far-reaching economic networks of the medieval world. Their ships didn't carry warriors alone. They carried merchants, craftsmen, and goods that moved across thousands of miles of sea routes and river systems, from the icy coast of Scandinavia to the bustling markets of the Middle East. Viking trade connected cultures that otherwise might have never met. Along these routes, a wide range of goods flowed through Viking hands. This would include furs, amber, slaves, silver, finely crafted weapons, silk that came from Northern Europe, the Baltics, places where they fought, all across Europe and the Middle East, from Francia to Byzantium. Many Viking traders traveled deep into Eastern Europe. They sailed along major river systems such as the Volga or the Dnieper. These rivers became economic highways that linked Scandinavia to distant markets far beyond the Baltic Sea. One of the most fascinating pieces of evidence for the massive trade network, it comes from archaeology. See, across Scandinavia, thousands of Viking silver hoards have been discovered buried in the fields, forests, and farmsteads. Many of the coins inside these hoards are Arab silver, minted by the Islamic caliphates. That means they would have come from thousands of miles away. These coins didn't arrive by accident. They showed that Viking merchants were connected to trade routes stretching deep into the Islamic world. Scandinavian traders, they were exchanging goods with markets as far away as Baghdad and Central Asia. In fact, many Viking economies ran primarily on silver weight, not coins stamped by their own kings, pieces of silver that were cut and weighed and traded according to value, making the Viking economy flexible and adaptable across many different cultures. Their trade routes ultimately stretched from the Arctic North to the Middle East, from the Atlantic coast to the great rivers of Eastern Europe. For their time, the Viking economy was astonishingly global. And those trade routes, they did more than move goods. They moved people, ideas, languages, and beliefs across continents. So trade carried Vikings across thousands of miles of rivers and seas. But trade alone doesn't explain how far these sailors were willing to go. Again and again, Viking crews pushed beyond familiar waters, sailing towards land no one in their world would have ever mapped. Which brings us to number 3, one of my favorites, exploration. Long before Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic, the Vikings were already pushing the edges of the known world. Their voyages were not accidents or lucky drifts across the ocean. They were the result of skilled sailors, durable ships, and a culture that valued bold journeys into the unknown. One of the first great steps in this expansion was the settlement of Iceland in the late 9th century. Norwegian settlers crossed the North Atlantic to build a new society free from Norwegian kings. When most civilizations were content with staying put or settling for a regular routine, the Viking Age explorers pushed even further west. Around the year 985, we have Eric the Red. He ventured into the unknown, and he led settlers to Greenland, establishing colonies all along the island's southwestern coast. But Viking exploration didn't stop there, because 15 years later, around 1000, Leif Erikson, Eric the Red's son, he sailed even further west and reached the shores of North America, a land the sagas call Vinland. Archaeological discoveries in Newfoundland confirmed that Norse explorers built settlements there roughly 500 years before Columbus even dreamed of a voyage to the Americas. Yet Viking exploration was not limited to the Atlantic. To the east, adventurers sailed deep into the river systems of Eastern Europe. They kept exploring, facing deadly rapids, learned that they could pull their ships out of the water, walk them across land, and carry them to calmer waters downriver. This venture, it continued. They just kept going to the semi-tropical and Mediterranean regions of the Black Sea and Constantinople and the Aegean Sea. And when the river ended, the north would continue south on foot, connecting with Baghdad, one of the greatest cities of the medieval world. Iran, it would have been within reach due to the Volga's connection to the Caspian Sea. And based on precedents and evidence, it's safe to say they went there too. Few cultures in the early medieval period explored so widely. Viking journeys connected distant regions that had rarely interacted before. In their time, the Vikings linked 3, possibly 4 continents through exploration and trade. So when we say they did it better than anyone, they did. Exploration explains how far the Vikings traveled, but it doesn't explain why they went. Which brings us to number 2, and the one I hope you take the most away from: courage. More than technology or tactics, the Vikings possessed a rare quality that shaped nearly everything they did. They were willing to go. They went across the unknown oceans, across hostile lands, towards places no one had mapped, to where they didn't know if they would be accepted, turned away, or attacked. Many sailors in history had ships. Many cultures had strong warriors. But not everyone had the courage to leave the safety of the familiar and to sail into waters where storm, ice, and distance could erase a crew without warning. But the Vikings did. The courage in the Viking world was not limited to exploration. Courage permeated every part of who they were, and they had it more than the rest of the world. They had courage in battle where warriors faced enemies in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Viking culture valued bravery and reputation. A person's honor was tied to how he stood when danger arrived. Retreat could mean shame, but standing firm could mean lasting fame, because there would be stories told afterward. To die with courage was more valuable than running in fear. There was the courage to survive in the harsh northern conditions. Long winters, freezing winds, and unpredictable seas demanded resilience. Farming in Iceland and Greenland required endurance, skill, and the courage to keep going. And perhaps most deeply, the Vikings carried a courage rooted in their view of fate. In Norse belief, every person had a destiny that couldn't be avoided. Since fate could not be escaped, the only meaningful choice was to face it with courage. The greatest heroes were those who met danger with honor, knowing the outcome might already be determined. Courage was knowing your fate was already written and deciding to make the story worth reading anyway. This mindset, it shaped a culture that valued bold action over hesitation. And the old saying goes, ships are safest in the harbor, but that's not what ships are built for. The Vikings lived that truth, and they lived it more courageously than anyone else. Well, we've talked about courage, exploration, trade, survival, and warfare. Each of these shaped the Viking world in a powerful way, and each were done better by the Vikings than anyone else that existed at that time. But if you step back and you look closely, you start to notice something. All of it depended on the same thing, the same tool, the same technology, the same brilliant piece of engineering. And before we reveal number 1, make sure you listen all the way to the end of the episode. I'm going to give you my email address again where you can connect more with the podcast. Share your thoughts on this new style of episode and send ideas for future top 10 of the Viking Age. And so here we go. Number 1 ties everything that we've discussed together, and it may be the single most important invention of the Viking world. Number 1, the Viking longship and Viking Age shipbuilding. At the center of everything the Vikings achieved was one thing: their ships. Viking shipbuilders created engineering marvels centuries ahead of their time. These vessels were not simply boats. They were carefully crafted machines designed for speed, strength, and flexibility in some of the most challenging waters on Earth. Their longships used clinker-built hulls, a method where overlapping wood planks were fastened together on the sides of the vessel. This design made the ship both light and incredibly strong, allowing it to flex with the ocean waves rather than fight against it. The results were remarkable. These ships had shallow drafts that allowed them to sail deep in the oceans and up narrow rivers. The ability to land directly on beaches without docks and harbors. They had incredible speed and maneuverability compared to most ships at that time. A Viking longship, it could cross the North Atlantic. It could survive storms. It could survive the open waters. And yet at the same time, it could sail up a river like the Seine, carrying warriors all the way to the gates of Paris. No other culture in Europe had that level of naval mobility. These ships made exploration possible. They enabled vast trade networks. They delivered armies with terrifying speed. They connected distant communities across oceans and rivers. The Viking Age was not built with swords. It was built with ships. Now, why did the Vikings build ships better than anyone else in the world? Part of the answer is geography. Scandinavia is a world of fjords, islands, rivers, and long coastlines. Travel by land, it was slow and difficult. Mountains, forests, harsh winters, it made roads unreliable. But the sea was a highway. For the Vikings, ships were not just tools for war. They were the center of life. Fishing, trade, exploration, communication between settlements. It all depended on boats. Shipbuilding became a skill refined over generations because their survival and prosperity depended on it. Another reason was craftsmanship. Viking shipbuilders used flexible oak planks, iron rivets, and carefully shaped keels that allowed the ship to bend with the waves instead of breaking against them. The clinker-built design made vessels lighter, faster, and more durable than any of the ships elsewhere in Europe. But perhaps the most important factor was the culture. The Vikings valued exploration. They valued bold journeys. The ships were not built simply to stay near the coast. They were built for the horizon. And when a culture builds ships for the horizon, it should not surprise us that those ships become the best in the world. And so, when we step back and we look at the Viking Age, something interesting becomes clear. Yes, they were warriors. Yes, they were raiders. But that's not what made them remarkable. What made the Vikings extraordinary was their range of ability. They were shipbuilders who engineered vessels that could cross the ocean. They were explorers who reached lands no one in Europe even knew existed. They were traders who connected Scandinavia to the Middle East. They were lawmakers who built assemblies and debated justice in open fields. They were storytellers who preserved their history long before the printing press existed. They were settlers who carved homes out of volcanic islands and Arctic coastlines. And above it all, they were people who were willing to leave the safety of the shore and sail into the unknown. The Viking Age wasn't built on one skill. It was built on a culture of boldness, ingenuity, and adaptability. And that combination changed the history of Europe. Now, this episode was a little bit different from our normal topics. This is a new style of episode that we're calling the Top 10 of the Viking Age. From time to time, over the next few seasons, we'll come back to this format and explore things like the top 10 Viking battles, leaders, weapons, myths, and legends. And so if you enjoyed this kind of episode, I really would love to hear from you. Send me your thoughts and your own episode ideas, Viking Legacy and Lore @gmail.com. And if this episode gave you a new perspective on the Viking Age, I appreciate it if you'd share it with someone that loves history. There are a lot of podcasts out there, but very few that explore the Viking world the way that we do. So until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.